Yes, thank you very much for that, Muduri. Here's a video that has more information about IRA.
In October 2020, 9 African organizations across the continent came together. We stand for accountability, inclusion, equity, and digital rights for all on the African continent. The African Internet Rights Alliance collectively works to address the inequalities and challenges we face online that are also reflected offline. As the internet and technology become more and more integrated into the lives of Africans, we face new challenges to our human rights in the digital context, including unequal access, internet shutdowns and restrictions, and violence online. Join us in the movement to advance inclusive and equitable digital rights for all on the African continent.
Thank you very much. At this point, I would want to welcome the moderator.
Thank you. Thanks, Masuri. Thanks for that. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My time right here in Nigeria. My name is Yanolu Afatoba. I work with Budget Foundation as a Comms Associate, and I'm excited to be here to be moderating this session. As we all know, we are talking about public participation in digital policy making in East Africa and by extension, the continent. And we'll be joined from some of our members' experiences from, all across Africa. We'll talk about, the experience with public participation in digital policy making, what has worked, what hasn't worked, the issues and the way forward. I want to confirm that this session is on record. It's been recorded, and we encourage everyone to join the conversation today. If you have follow-up questions, you can drop the question for Astronaut. I'm very sure she's typing on the chat box right now, or you can send it directly to the chat. You can also raise your hands when we call for questions. So also, I'd like to invite us to follow IRA on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, just to know more about what we're about and then our work in Africa, when it comes to digital inclusion, digital rights, and freedom of expression. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce, so you can see some of our links in the chat box. My colleague will drop that right now, so you can follow us, please. Thank you. So without further ado, we'll just go straight into it. Our panelists, like I mentioned earlier, they are drawn from 4 of our IRA member organizations. I know we heard about them while Suri was giving an introduction earlier. And they have significant experience, and they will be sharing information, stimulate conversation, reflection, and discussion by raising key questions and issues that we can discuss about the theme of today's discourse. So very quickly, I'd like to welcome my panelists. Can you all kindly turn on your video so we can see your faces? Thank you. Yes. So right with me here, I have Victor Capillo. Victor is a lawyer and a human rights defender, researcher, and tech enthusiast at Kictonet. Victor, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Happy to be here. Hi,
Victor. You're welcome. You just take 2 minutes to introduce. Can you take 2 minutes to introduce yourself for that, Victor? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Capillo. I'm a researcher and human rights lawyer working from Nairobi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Thanks. I'd like to so up next,
Okay, seems like Yanu is having some trouble with connection. Are you back, Yanu?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I was asking Ekai to introduce himself. Ekai is Program Officer, East Africa Paradigm Initiative. Ekai, are you there?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Ekai Nabenyo. I work with the Paradigm Initiative. Am I getting short? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I work with Paradigm Initiative as a program officer for East Africa, and I'm based in Nairobi. Yes, I look forward to interesting discussions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Ekai. Thank you. We look forward to your session. To Lillian Nawoga, Program Officer, Program Manager at PESA. Lillian, are you there?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Naroba Lillian, and yes, I work with PESA. Happy to be here and to interact with you all. Look forward to the session.
Okay, thank you so much, Lillian. And Ephraim, is Ephraim here yet?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I had challenges connecting. I connected as a participant, so I was on the webinar side. My name is Ephraim Pasikenyanito. I work with Article 19, and I'm very excited to be here and to meet everyone in this session. Looking forward to fruitful interactions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ephraim. Thank you, everyone, panelists here today. And also, very quickly, we'll have our first two speakers. That's Victor and Ekai, and they will be talking more on highlights and some findings from public participation in the digital policy in Eastern Africa. Well, of course, after these presentations, we'll move into a more global discourse, talking about Africa as a continent. But to streamline the conversation, first of all, I would like to invite Ekai, first of all, a representative from Paradigm, to make okay, well, let's have Victor first from KicToNet. Victor, can you just, let's give you 10 minutes, tell us about your findings and what you've discovered about public participation in digital policy making in Eastern Africa. Can we have you, Victor, for the next 10 minutes?
Thank you, Yano, and pleasure to meet you all, colleagues and participants. I'd like to share some findings of research that we did last year and finished this year. We're talking about the state of public participation in ICT policymaking in Kenya. We conducted a review of various policymaking processes, basically the processes leading up to the development of Kenya's ICT policy, Kenya's Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, and the Data Protection Act. And what we wanted to explore was basically the extent to which these processes facilitated the participation of the public and incorporated their views and perspectives in the process of making this legislation. So we used a set of indicators, basically 6 indicators which are developed by the global partners as part of the diagnostic toolkit on multi-stakeholder participation. The 6 indicators basically were open and accessible, diverse. We're also looking at to what extent the processes were collaborative, how were they evidence-based, were they transparent and accountable, and finally, whether they were consensus-driven. And in terms of what we were able to see from Kenya is that it's basically a mixed bag of participation, depending on the process. One of the things that emerged, for example, we had the data protection process, which on the indicator of openness and accessibility, there were several opportunities that were provided for the public to engage. There was a lot of interest and contributions. You know, the government went out of its way to engage the public, including at the county level, and also there was political will. On the flip side, previous processes such as the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act development process was characterized by a lot of limitations in terms of openness and accessibility, because here you found that the process, there were a lot of restrictions. It was a very closed process. There was a lot of secrecy, including in the terms of the documents that were being considered. This is the bills. There was very poor communication to the public in terms of just to what extent, what is being developed, what are the goals, what are the aims, very poor representation, and of course, very short deadlines and timelines for notices. Here we could find instances where the public was given, less than 3 days to respond to a 30-page bill, which we found to be quite unfortunate. The other aspect that we looked at was the diversity of the process. And the best example that we saw was in the data protection process. And here we were able to detail a lot of buy-in and input by a very diverse set of stakeholders, both from different parts of the country, foreign countries, multinationals, all collaborating to contribute to the process. So there was a lot of input by basically reinforcing the multi-stakeholder model. And therefore, there were a lot of views that were captured based on the interests of the stakeholders. On the flip side, we noted that there was also a lack of diversity and participation in the ICT policy process. And so this was marked by a failure to publish the inputs as was done in the data protection process. There was poor documentation in terms of what were the inputs and contributions given by various stakeholders. There was poor feedback and very limited participation of stakeholders, which meant that the process was not as diverse as other processes that followed, such as the data protection process. The other aspect that we looked at was in terms of collaboration and the extent to which the processes were consensus-driven. And we can see that the ICT policy process was characterized by a very multi-stakeholder approach, which was also community and public-driven. There was a common purpose to develop a policy to review the 2006 ICT policy. There was a very deliberate bottom-up approach, and which was very collaborative because the government engaged with society, with various organizations, various stakeholders, told them that we are developing this process, can you come and support? And the groups were able to organize themselves and come up with the draft policy. In terms of what process did not do well under that indicator, we saw that the cybercrime process was characterized by a lot of unilateral decision-making and poor consensus and collaboration. We saw a very disjointed approach, duplicate processes. At some point, there were 3 or 4 bills all addressing the issue of cybercrimes or cybersecurity. The processes were very closed. There was a small committee of about 10 people, which was not representative. It was largely comprised of government officials who came up with the initial versions of the bill. There was poor collaboration, and you see that power imbalance between government and other stakeholders meant that the views of other stakeholders were not well captured. And the end result being that this specific law was challenged in court shortly after its development, which basically confirms that it was not representative and did not capture all the issues that stakeholders raised. The other indicator that we looked at was evidence, in terms of the use of evidence, the balance of experts. The data protection process, which was the most recent process, demonstrated a good balance of expertise, whether from local, in-country, or also externally, because the task force that was appointed sent out a call and people were able to submit their views. And the task force also used a lot of evidence and facts as was presented to them to make their decisions and to frame the data protection law. On the flip side, the cybercrime process, as I've already indicated, was characterized by a lot of limited expertise and evidence. There were a lot of capacity gaps. The discourse on cybercrime law was very fragmented. Stakeholders' views were neglected because also the opportunities for submitting those views were very few and limited, and as such, the body which was developing this law was not given did not have sufficient opportunity to interact with the evidence that was available. Also, the other aspect that we looked at was in terms of transparency and accountability of the processes. Yet again, the data protection process in Kenya showed that it was possible to have clear articulation of stakeholder interests and also representation of different stakeholders. It was also possible to document each and every contribution that was made by stakeholders and also to make them publicly available. One of the challenges we have is that in some cases, stakeholders contribute, but other stakeholders don't know what others have contributed, and as such, it can make it difficult to respond to the issues because you don't know what people are saying. So by making them public, making them available meant that the process was also very transparent. There was a clear roadmap, a clear engagement process, clear timelines, within which people are supposed to engage. On the flip side, the cybercrime process lacked transparency and accountability. The process was marked with a lot of opacity. It was closed. There was a lot of secrecy of documentation. There were no public reports. There were no documentation of submissions. And so it is very unclear how they finally arrived at the final bills. The processes for decision-making were very unilateral. And there was also a lack of a clear roadmap because you can even see in terms of how disjointed the process was that led to the ultimate version of the bill. So in conclusion, what we recommended was that there needs to be a holistic and multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder mechanism for public participation. And of course, the enactment of a public participation law to ensure that there is sufficient notice period for the public to engage. There is need for collaboration, development of common purposes and goals with stakeholders, and also the need for the use of objective, extensive, and evidence to develop policies and laws. And of course, finally, that there needs to be formal procedures and mechanisms for the public to engage in policy and lawmaking processes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for that. So very quickly, I'm sure we'll come back to some of the presentations you made, during the question and answer session. But I want us to have Ekai Nabenyo. That's as Delia is a representative from Paradigm Initiative. As we all know, Paradigm Initiative, they've worked over the years at the intersection of ensuring and fostering public participation in digital policy, for a while, and then would like Ekai to, talk about the effectiveness of some of the tools and platforms that Paradigm Initiative uses to advance public participation in digital policy making processes. Ekai, you now have the floor, please.
Yes, thanks a lot for that opportunity. So my name is Ekai. As I mentioned, I work with Paradigm Initiative, and I am working based in Nairobi, in charge of the Eastern Africa region. So we work on matters, digital rights and digital inclusion here in Eastern Africa. So, I mean, Burundi, South Sudan, Nairobi, Kenya, Tanzania, and all that. We've been working there. So COVID-19 presented a very interesting, challenge to all of us. Of course, we couldn't meet. We couldn't, have our normal meetings. Parliament could not convene as they usually do to make laws, and the public could not gather to scrutinize, the laws that were being, prescribed to them by the lawmakers, or even the regulations which were being made by the Minister for Health, the Cabinet Secretary for Health. So we had a scenario whereby, you have a presidential directive that is saying, this will be the newest law in town. There will be curfew from this time to this time. But of course, a presidential directive, the president exercising his powers under the Constitution as the head of the executive. But the questions we've been asking ourselves as, human rights advocates and, people who really want to see the law being followed and people participating in lawmaking is that how much did the citizens participate in that particular policy making? So every time you see a gazette notice, curfew from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., or it's been revised, It's now from 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. But that has not been ratified by the citizens. But of course, that is the law empowers the cabinet secretary to do that. But regulations being part of the law, they also need to be subjected to public scrutiny by members of the public and the citizens and people who reside in Kenya, of course, who are subject to those laws and regulations. Because it will be absurd to prosecute, for instance, somebody on the strength of COVID-19 regulation issued by the Minister of Health, when that particular regulation was not subjected to adequate public participation. And public participation is one thing, but actually the public participating is another thing. I mean, you may have, for instance, in Turkana County, there is a Public Participation Act of 2015, which says that before the County Assembly of Turkana enacts a law, they have to go, through the sub-counties and the villages and all that. But, having that law in place is one thing, and actually the law, being actualized is another thing. So that is a question which we ourselves at Paradigm Initiative have been asking. And of interest to us was the fact that, there were the data protection regulations, which were issued by the Minister of ICT and specifically the Office of the Data Commissioner. And I remember I attended one event virtually, which was organized by our partners that the lawyers have. And they, as private citizens, they took initiative and decided to organize a public participation forum, invited CS Musheru, invited the data commissioner, invite other stakeholders, the directors, to come and engage with the public on matters, data protection regulations, which were being issued during the COVID-19 period. So we participated in that particular forum, and you could see a tweet from the Office of the Data Commissioner saying, "Oh, the regulations are now uploaded on the website, and you can log into ict.go.ke, download them, and then submit comments between tomorrow and the other day," which is very inadequate, because we need to have citizens having enough time to scrutinize these regulations, because they are subject to them, and it will be an absurdity to prosecute a citizen, for instance, for breaching this particular regulation, which they never participated in making. Maybe they are not even aware that it is law. So that has been the biggest concern we've had. Of course, COVID-19 brought a lot of challenges, a new normal, which is everything virtual. Parliament, some parliamentarians were joining parliament from the comfort of their homes, of course, because of COVID-19. And the question we're asking ourselves is, do we still maintain the quality of the lawmaking that we used to have when we were, doing things, fiscally as citizens or as Kenyans before the onset of COVID-19? So in the Eastern Africa region, we've also tried to push for a law in Tanzania during this particular COVID-19 period. We tried to push for, digital rights and freedoms bill, and we gathered, stakeholders in Tanzania, advocates and journalists and members of the private sector, members of civil society, active citizens like bloggers. We gathered them at our hotel in Dar es Salaam, and we had engagements, between us and them via video link. I was in Nairobi, and my bosses were in Nigeria, and others in Zambia, and in Cameroon and all that. And we had that law being discussed and being commented on, of course, taking advantage of technology and Zoom, like we are doing today, to try to bridge the gap that try to exist between those who can access the internet and therefore can interrogate the law, and the majority of Kenyans who are in the villages and the forgotten corners of this country. So we had those discussions trying to create a hybrid of both virtual and physical. So some people are gathering in Tanzania, and of course at that time, because it was the era of President Magufuli, so Tanzania was not really strict on gatherings as such. So we could gather 30 stakeholders in Tanzania, and then join via video link from Nairobi and from Lagos, and then address the policy that we wanted to enact into law, to ensure that digital rights for the citizens in Tanzania are guaranteed. We also did the same in Somalia. We had a 2021 stakeholders convening on digital rights legislation in Somalia. So we spoke with the Minister of ICT, had a forum, but the Somalia one, because of the the interesting context in Somalia and security and all that, it was entirely virtual. So I think what we've learned as a Paradigm Initiative in our work and observing the work of our partners is the fact that, I mean, due to the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to be creative as human rights advocates. We had to be creative as a civil society. We had to be creative as parliament, the lawmakers, and therefore we couldn't just shut down parliament and shut down policy making. Of course, there was a way that had to continue, but while still abiding by the new rules and regulations and new normals brought about by COVID-19, and that is why the Parliament of Kenya was meeting sometimes virtually, sometimes a hybrid of the two, which is a good thing, because you can imagine if Parliament or the Ministry of Health did not issue those regulations, it means people could flout the COVID-19 regulations as they wish, because they know there are no penal sanctions. So we need the law, even if we can't meet, but we need the laws. So that is where the regulations come in. That is why Parliament convening virtually comes in. And that is, all those intricacies are, of course, brought about by COVID-19, but it's been a very interesting era for us at Paradigm Initiative. We always love to organize people and talk to them in our hotel, engage them, the human touch to the discussions. But when you have, citizens being asked to provide their comments on a document which has been circulated to them, within 24 hours, and maybe most of them, because of, they have lost their jobs during COVID-19, and therefore they can't be able to access internet, that is a big challenge to policy making. So that is the question we should be asking ourselves in the Eastern Africa region, in the Southern Africa region, across the world. Are we making laws that people are aware of, or we are just passing regulations and regulations after regulations and passing laws without people commenting on them, because there is now a lacuna that has been, a vacuum that has been created by the fact that we can't convene due to COVID-19. So that is what I can say about the work of Paradigm Initiative in the Eastern Africa region, specifically in policy making, vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges presented. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ekai. Thank you so much. That was quite elaborative. And your session actually preempted some of my questions that I would have loved to drop later. But, before we come back to those, I'd like to just quickly move into the panel conversation with four of our panelists, that's Ephraim, Lillian, Victor, Ekai, Ephraim, Lillian, Victor, and Ekai, four of them, sorry. Yes, so like I said earlier, we are looking at this from two perspectives. It is important that people who are most affected by ICT trends have a say in policymaking, digital policymaking in Africa. And then that was what Victor and Ekai did by telling us what they've been up to, the organizations in Kenya, Eastern Africa. So now we want to move into something a bit more elaborative right now, talking about Africa as a continent. And I'd like to, start the panel conversation. I would like to direct the first question to Ephraim, but in the meantime, please, if you drop the question in the chat box so we can begin to compile them, or you can send directly to the other host of this particular session, and then she would compile it from our end. Yeah, thank you. So we'll have just about 15 minutes approximately for questions after this panel session. So very quickly, Ephraim, so I want us to talk about what Article 19 has found to be key digital trends in the Eastern African region in 2021. And like I said, let's just, space this within the African continent. And then some of these trends, how have they been influenced by the public? Ephraim, that's for you.
Thank you so much, Ephraim here. I'm very excited just to re-echo what Ekai has mentioned. So some of the challenges and some of the trends that Ekai has mentioned, for example, the recent enhancement of policy making as a result of using ICTs. So a long time ago, for those who have engaged in this work for a while, you'll remember how this has gradually progressed over the last couple of years, in which, for example, a long time ago, it was hard to know when policymakers were meeting. So you would get a very short notice. For example, the same report that Victor has mentioned, the report that they recently published, you would not know when this bill is going to be discussed, where, and the notice would be short. I remember, for example, some of you might know the time Kenya was coming up with a cybersecurity bill. There was two different versions, one at the Senate and one at the National Assembly. And the one at the National Assembly, the one at the Senate, there was a time when there was a notice on a Friday for Friday's newspaper, and Friday with people being asked to participate and go to meet senators. At the time, Senator Mutahi Kagwe was the chair of the ICT committee, was the vice chair with Senator Gideon Moi. I think it was Mutahi Kagwe, the ICT chair at the time, and it had still the current ICT committee members, including Senator Gideon Moi and others, and it being on a Monday, and even just for a common citizen to be able to access the Senate. It's not just everyone who can have the courage to go and have this conversation. For example, this bill, how it was drafted at the time, it would affect everyone from bloggers to anyone using social media. So not any social media user could be able to walk into the Senate that Monday morning and engage. And that Monday morning, there were like only 3 or 4 different institutions there. And that was very concerning. But then that has moved. Right now, with the use of ICT, people are able to engage and log in and participate. Unfortunately or fortunately, with pros and cons. Some of you might have seen, for example, some chats from in this webinar from someone named iPhone. Sometimes people engage, but sometimes they become offensive. Even, for example, in this webinar, as you might have seen. So that is the challenge, but you need to slowly transition and make people realize the importance of engaging in some of these conversations and how to engage with decorum and to push for policy changes properly without antagonizing or without pushing away, engaging in very beneficial conversation with policymakers. So some of the I'll highlight a report which I'll share at the end of this conversation that we released recently as Article 19. We released a report that focuses on 3 issues. So 1, freedom of expression online, internet accessibility and affordability, privacy and data protection, the trends covering 6 countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. So this was very intensive research that has highlighted some of the, just re-echoing some of the trends that Victor mentioned. The report that Victor worked on was focused on Kenya, but they are the same trends across the region. So gradually things are changing, but they're not like the best of the best. Some countries are really advanced when it comes to policy making or transparency and engaging citizens. For example, I'll give a shout out to the government of Rwanda. For example, even cabinet meetings, you would find these release of minutes from cabinet meetings that are held every other week or so in Rwanda, the government of Rwanda. In other places across the region, you might find there's challenges in accessing some of the laws, some of the information, and we need to really pull up our socks. I don't know if Rwanda, they're doing very well, maybe because they are a smaller country, but this is some of the, in terms of access to information for policy making. So, this policy is being discussed, this policy was passed, this policy was pushed forward by this specific cabinet minister or something like that. So it's something that there is need to leverage use of ICTs, whereby citizens should be able to know what policy making, what policies are being discussed and how to involve themselves. So the onus now remains yes, when the government is transparent, now the onus would be on the citizens to be literate and engage in a meaningful manner. So that would be now the next challenge. But then in the rest of the region, you'd find a bit of challenges in terms of less transparency. You sometimes, for example, I'll give a very specific example, use of Universal Access Fund, which is across the region. We have had several meetings across the region, and it's good. Ekai mentioned Somalia. People forget Somalia is part of Eastern Africa, and South Sudan, and you'd find this is enacted in the law, but then there is no like regular release disclosure of information on how this fund is being used, how much is in the fund, how much deficit is there. So I'll give a shout out, for example, to the Communications Authority in Kenya, which releases annual information and regular information on. We've released this funds to this institution. Most of it has been focused towards high schools and primary schools in rural counties within Kenya. So this is just some of the positive trends that are happening. But then just to re-echo what Victor and Ekai mentioned, the first step should be more disclosure than less disclosure. Then from there, the government can be like, hey, we release all this information, but then people don't participate. And in meaningful, not just an information release on Friday and come to meet the Senate or the National Assembly on Monday, or the cabinet minister on Monday, when people maybe were out of town or far away. So that's kind of prior meaningful participation. And just to mention and highlight, there's ongoing litigation in Kenya. I don't know if it's at the Court of Appeal now, or it's gone to the Supreme Court in terms of what is meaningful public participation, because there's so many laws that have been pushed out in Kenya, because Kenya, under Article 10 of the Constitution, there's a constitution limit in terms of a constitutional guarantee that any policy-making process should be done with meaningful participation. That might not be the same across the rest of the region, but then even with Kenya having that Article 10 of the Constitution, I would, given, yes, I'm Kenyan, I would point out that in terms of information disclosure, sometimes we lag behind as compared to neighboring countries, as compared to, as I gave a shout out to Rwanda and maybe even other countries. So we need to have more meaningful participation. And I'd be very curious to see the litigation in Kenya go, or where it will go in terms of what would be the threshold of meaningful public participation in policy-making processes. So that would be my my summary, and not to re-echo too much what Ekai and Victor have mentioned regarding their research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. Thanks for that. Okay. So, Lillian, could you just, share from what Ephraim has said? Ephraim was able to tell us, the extent to which, they've made progress in ensuring that citizens are integrated into policy-making process, and then some more. But for Lillian, I'd like you to just, talk about some of the most effective strategies for citizen engagement in digital policy-making process in Africa. I know, could you just, expatiate more on that?
Thank you. Although, yes, I didn't hear the last part.
Okay.
Yeah, just repeat maybe like the last 30 seconds, I didn't hear anything.
Oh, sorry about that. So I was saying that, drawing from Ephraim's discussion, I would like you to share some of the most effective strategies for citizen engagement in digital policy-making process in Africa, because I know that your work is not really secluded to Eastern Africa. It's more, about the continent alike. So can you just share some of those effective strategies with us based on the work you've done, Professor?
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, I will not say so much about CIPESA, since I believe everyone on the call knows some bits and bits about CIPESA. But in regard to digital policy making processes, one is, I think when starting this conversation, we need to first go back to understand, when we talk about digital policy, what do we refer to? And once we get that, then we are able to know how to best go around, the policy making process. So, I presume that perhaps my panelists know what, what it entails to when we speak about digital policy. But I'll just say that, it is more of, it entails utilizing and promoting some of the opportunities offered by digitalization. And part of this may include regulation of digital and electronic communications, network information security, the frequency in, policy issues concerning a broad range of, different, issues, whether it's access or infrastructure development. So when we have that in mind, then we get into understanding how do we get the citizens to understand, how do we engage them in the digital policy making. At CIPESA, I think what we have based so much on is researching and understanding what are the digital trends, what is happening, in the digital world, and how can this, is there a need for a policy? Is there an existing policy? If not, then if there's a policy, is it in favor of different digital rights? Does it, promote or does it not promote? So researching and understanding the digital trends is one of the things that we focus on at CIPESA. And in fact, right now, if you go, we've researched on quite a number of digital topics, from privacy to surveillance to, big things of, digital infrastructure access and access to information, and quite a number of things. So when you understand that, then it is easier to engage the citizens to know that, you have a right to, this is affecting you in this way, and there needs to be a policy. So part of that, when we research, then we disseminate these findings. So it is these findings that we usually have this kind of recommendations that there is this issue, this is what we've found on the ground, and these are the perceptions, or maybe it is we're looking at perceptions or views from, citizens, and then we then put up a policy recommendation that, there needs to be a policy developed around this. If it is promoting privacy and data protection, then there has to be a recommendation. And then it is always clear, and when we do this, to the policymakers, there's a particular recommendation for them. To the implementers, if there's it's an existing law or policy, there's a particular recommendation. If it is to the different entities or, actors involved. The other thing that I think is working is the issue of stakeholder engagements, not just citizens, because, when a policy is made, whether you're a policy maker, whether you're implementer or law enforcement or service provider, you become a user of this policy. It affects you in one way or another. So stakeholder engagements running from, engaging policymakers, getting them to understand the implications of, of some of the issues that may be raised from the research, from the trend. Right now we have COVID, surveillance, privacy violations, we have things of misinformation, disinformation. So if a law is to come out like that, then we'll try to find a way of how we can engage with, one is the policymakers, for them to understand what potential impact this could be on the citizens. But away from that, for the citizens, we usually do capacity building, because digital policy making involves, multi-stakeholder, approach. And I think from the previous panelists, they mentioned, some of the shortfalls they experienced, engaging in, say, policy making in Kenya, where you wake up today, there's a policy coming up, and 2 days later it's passed. And people don't understand what the issues are. So engaging citizens, capacity building, we mainly focus around, say, in the digital rights space, we'll look at, say, human rights defenders, journalists, build their capacity to be able to understand policy-making processes, what is a digital policy? How should you get involved? We found that, that kind of, strategy has worked. The other that I'll talk about would be, there's one thing to build the capacity, but then at times there's need for some expertise, kind of opinion, on a particular issue, or if in this case it could be policy making. So the one thing that we've also found that works, has worked, is providing commentaries, on policies as they're being developed, because in most cases you may not be so much involved in the actual drafting. At times you're called in when the draft is already out, and there's need for, there's need for comment or feedback, from, of course, us coming from civil society. So we provide these commentaries. In Uganda, for instance, we've successfully done commentaries on the data protection and privacy law, where some of the things that were highlighted as problematic, some of these, were passed, some of these were removed. There were some wins and losses. We back, I think, in 2010, 2011, when we were looking at cyber laws, CIPESA was active in, providing commentary and feedback to that. We've done commentaries in, say, commentaries Tanzania on some of the regulations there and the policies there. So we found that when you provide this kind of expert kind of opinion, then the citizens who are, in this case, the digital users, will be able to come and say, this has been highlighted, this is an issue. We too need to get involved and start, engaging and advocating on that. The other thing, of course, why we are all here is, another strategy is the convening, meetings to deliberate on some of these things. Whereas right now on this call, we are just talking about, public participation and digital making process and all that. But at the same time, it is more of an awareness and engagement, sharing ideas. And this also is one way in which you can get citizens to participate in, digital policy making, because then they're able to meet, share, understand what the current issues are, and see how they can get involved. So in a nutshell, I would say that one is researching and understanding that trends, is an important strategy for you, or for, for anyone who is involved in digital making process, because without you having a clear understanding of what the issues are, you may not be able to influence or even engage the policymakers. Of course, the capacity building, whether it is the policymakers themselves or if it is the citizens. In this case, citizens usually categorize them to different, human rights defenders or people who are involved, who are most likely to be affected by the policies that come out, and awareness and commentary and meetings, convening sessions like this, or even the forum that we are having right now, is one way of engaging, citizens, to them to understand what are the policy issues and how they can get involved. So for now, that is what I can say as one of the some of the strategies that we see working in the region.
Okay, thank you so much, Lillian. That was actually very robust and insightful. Thank you for sharing those strategies with us. So, okay, so I want to take a step backwards from the citizens now. For Ekai. Ekai, I want to direct this question to you. So we've spoken about, Lillian and Ephraim, they've spoken about the policies, the strategies that work for, engaging the citizens and ensuring that, they can share their perspectives and, participate in some of these processes and policy-making processes. So I want to ask you, when it comes to responsiveness from leaders and from policymakers, state actors, what has been your experience with that? What's the level of responsiveness? Would you say that, citizens sharing their perspectives and then trying to get involved in these processes, would you say these attempts have, yielded results, and what has been their responses to some of these, perspectives and actions from the citizens? Ekai, that's for you.
Yes. So my experience on that, generally on public participation, has been as a Kenyan citizen, I have tried to participate in lawmaking before, even outside our organization. So one experience which I have noted with public participation in this country, in Kenya, and I'm sure the story of Kenya is a reality across Africa, is that every time you are called for a public participation forum, you go there, make your views, make noise, bang tables, and then the document which is finally produced and printed at the government printers is the exact document which came from Parliament. So it means the citizens are only a conveyor belt. They are only ticking a box. They are not taking your comments into consideration, because I would expect that after the public participation forums, the bill which goes back to Parliament, and the report which is being made to Parliament by that particular committee that is in charge of that particular law, is that, okay, we've gone to the country, we've collected this particular comments, and then this is what Kenyans or Tanzanians or Ugandans are saying, and then that is incorporated in a law, so that the law which goes to the report stage, the committee stage, the third reading, all those other stages, is actually a law that has incorporated the comments by the public. So my experience, specifically on this, is that we've achieved what Professor PLO Lumumba will call the webinarization of policymaking in Africa. So we've made policymaking to be like any other webinar. I mean, send a Zoom link, people attend, 2 participants, proceed, tick the box, and we are done. So we've tried to make noise about this, try to urge the leaders to make public participation meaningful, and or maybe to be to sound political, make public participation great again, because we used to know public participation as that which brings citizens together. They make comments on a document. It is rectified as they wish, as the citizens wish, and then that is taken into consideration. So my experience has been that sometimes the system, the leaders have not been as responsive as we expected, especially in terms of making public participation work better. So you go to a webinar, make comments, then the document you see being taken to the next stage is the same document you analyze it and and mark it on a red pen, like every page you have marked, which is really sad, because that means our comments have not been taken into consideration, and the leaders need to act on that. And I'm sure the experience I'm talking about Kenya is the reality across Africa, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Zambia, in all these countries we live in as Africans. All this is the reality in Africa. So that is the experience I have had, and it's a bit unfortunate. So the government should try webinarization of public participation. If it fails, they can try social distance, the physical gatherings, and people actually going through the document. And in fact, talking about that, there is one document which rented all the headlines of all newspapers in Kenya, and all headlines, a document called the Building Bridges Initiative Bill, which in essence sought to amend the Constitution of Kenya and introduce some changes. So that particular bill has been challenged in courts. It has failed the test of legality. And then there are Kenyans in this country who have never seen that document. They have never seen it. So how and we are changing a constitution. We are not changing a regulation. We are not changing a policy document. We are not changing some act of, we are changing the supreme law of the land. But there are some Kenyans who have heard about BBI just on television or newspapers. They have no idea how the BBI bill, as it were, looks like, which is a failure of public participation. So the leaders need to act and change the manner in which public participation has been done in Africa. Thanks.
Wow. Thanks, Ekai. I'm sure you would have a follow-up question, for that. But very quickly before we do that, I'd like to touch on with Victor from Kicternet. Victor, are you there?
Yes.
So, okay, so Victor, very quickly, I want you to kind of talk about gender disparities in public participation within the digital space. Do we have something like that? And if we do, what can you give us, highlight some of these disparities, based on what you've done in Africa?
Yes, thank you, Yano. I think one of the first and most important questions we need to answer is how are women, and not just women alone, but women and other marginalized groups using the internet and ICTs. I think that's an important question that needs to be addressed because we can't be saying, to women and all these groups, come and participate to govern a resource which you don't have access to. So it is important to first address that digital divide, to promote and include women and all these marginalized groups, youth, persons with disabilities, and so on into the internet and ICT ecosystem. Once they are brought on board, then their views, will make sense, in the sense of they will understand what is being asked. Be that as it may, women participation in governance remains low, and not just in Kenya, but across the continent. Of course, this is changing, but there's need for more affirmative action measures to promote the participation of women in governance, and that includes the governance of ICTs and the internet, because it is once they are brought on board that they're able to participate effectively and meaningfully. Therefore, state agencies that are leading or developing policies and laws need to put in place mechanisms to reach out to these groups, to identify their specific needs and incorporate those in the legislative and policy processes. I think it's 2021. It's not enough for a government agency to say we have made a call for public participation. It's 15:30. They need to take steps to target specifically these groups who are not the usual group of people who participate in these processes, find out their needs, and incorporate those needs and the solutions that they are proposing into policies and legislation. At the same time, they need to invest in research that actually targets these particular groups and identifies the needs, and therefore we have a very clear evidence base of the needs of these specific groups, so that then the evidence is made available to everybody who's participating in the process. Otherwise, if we do not take these steps, then women and other marginalized groups will be left behind. And yet, as the population data reveals, women constitute 50% of the population in most of these countries. So they're an equal shareholder in the ecosystem, and therefore they must be included. And the barriers to participation needs to be removed so that the internet becomes a space for everyone. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you so much, Victor. Thanks for that. So very quickly, before we go into the question and answer section, I would like to ask Ephraim one last question. So we've had a lot of perspectives from Victor, from Ekai, and from yourself, Ephraim. So I'd like you to just touch on some recommendations for enhancing voices. It's also not just enough that we have enough voices. We have to make sure that these voices, this perspective, translate into changes in the policymaking process and consideration on the part of the government and policymakers. And Ekai, was able to tell us some of the issues that pertaining to getting the required action from the policymakers and the government as far as citizens' participation is concerned. So Ephraim, I want you to just talk about recommendations, like just what do you think we can do to enhance voices, and then to also ensure that from the aspect or from the part of the government and policymakers, we have, the required action, the required response when it comes to citizens' perspectives and their opinions on policy, digital policies. Ephraim.
Thank you so much, Yano. So the first most important thing, we can have really amazing policies, but then have not very good, not being able to implement it very well. Reason being lack of resources. So the first most important thing I would like to recommend is about resources, to ensure that policymakers, when coming up with this process of policy making, they plan resources in terms of human and other resources. So as I mentioned earlier, you would go and meet. And it was good a long time ago. It was especially in Kenya. Other parts of Eastern Africa might be a bit different, might vary from country to country, or from policy to policy, or from committee to committee. You would find that sometimes policy making process is accessing the place is a bit difficult. So trying to ensure that the resources are planned in a way that it's easier for people to access. And also you have the right capacity in terms of human resources, the policy makers, in terms of the secretariat that helps in collating the views from the public, people who understand a specific policy issue. But right now with the ICT, advent of use of ICT with after COVID period, that is changing. So trying to ensure that these resources, the ICT resources, are used properly, and people are made aware in terms of this. You can use this. The second bit is in terms of information literacy, ensuring that people are investing in ensuring that there's awareness among citizens in terms of they are more literate in terms of the importance of these policies that are being drafted, and to encourage more public participation from whoever, and ensuring that everyone is aware that this is not just a remit for MPs, but it's open to the public. And then the third bit is about opening the spaces more widely in terms of giving adequate time. So meaningful participation, like 2 weeks notice, 3 weeks notice, meaningful and predictable participation, in a way to ensure that citizens are able to engage with policymakers in a meaningful manner, and to be able to for them to plan. For example, if it's a physical meeting, for them to plan early enough, for them to travel if it's outside their counties. I'll give just an echo the report that Victor mentioned, because I was part of that process, compared between the Kenyan cybersecurity policy, the act when it was being drafted, both at the Senate and the National Assembly, and also the Data Protection Act. You'll notice when there were bills, the cybersecurity conversation was centered only around Nairobi most of the time. In terms of the public participation processes, there was only 1 or 2 public or 3 public participation processes within Nairobi, and this is something that is subject to an appeal at the Court of Law in terms of how the process went. Whereas the data protection law, when it was being drafted, the policymakers went across various counties. They collected views across various counties. So to ensure that there's meaningful, there was like a predictable schedule. A schedule was released, I remember, in July for the entire October. How I remember most of those meetings were held in Thursdays and Fridays. How members of parliament would move from Nanyuki to Kisumu to Mombasa and every other places. It was predictable. You would know they were going to have this conversation at this specific venue on this specific date. And that also links back to the first bit in terms of resources. There was resources to do that. So the same way the finance bill, if there's a bill that is normally very well interrogated across most of Eastern Africa, is the finance bill or finance act every year. Whenever there are amendments in the budgets, there's movement by treasury officials and responsible ministry officials having these conversations and having this at various, like at the grassroots level. It would be really amazing and awesome if we get to a level when that is happening across the region, or if we stick to the ICT way of doing things, ensure that there's more awareness and more open spaces in terms of citizens and being able to engage. I think those are the 3 key recommendations. 1, resources. 2, meaningful participation. 3, information literacy among citizens. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ephraim. Thanks for that. So very quickly, a big thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much for delving into that particular topic with your experiences. Thank you so much. So very quickly, I'd like to go to the question and answer session with our panelists. Please, if you have any question, I want to open the floor to the audience for the remaining 15 minutes that we have. So if you have a question for any of the panelists or for the panel, in general, you can just raise your hand or send a message to the chat, and we'll pick it up from there. But before we have some of those questions, I'd like to ask a few. I have like 1 or 2 questions for Lillian, Victor, and Ekai. So for Lillian, I know that you've done some work involving persons with disabilities in digital right policy making processes, right? So please, could you, because there's no talking about public participation without talking about, persons with disabilities. And I just want you to talk about, some of the strategies that you've used to ensure that, some of these processes, public participation processes are, they factor in persons with disabilities. Lillian.
Right, thank you. Like any of the strategies that I initially mentioned, since 2018, CPS has been documenting through research about people with disabilities, and this is part of our digital inclusion program. We started this with when we had the OTT, the social media tax that is now repealed, and part of this involved a comprehensive study on how this tax was affecting people with disabilities. So part of this was we had to bring together different representatives, share with them these findings. But that aside, later on, still, I think in the same year, 2018, Uganda had a draft ICT policy for people with disabilities, and we did provide our comments and comprehensive analysis of what it was entailing. And it so happens that around that time, of course, there's been, from the ministry, drafting a policy to the Communications Commission conducting study about that the particular topic. We've been involved in that. And now, fast forward more recently is we are now getting to actually fund or provide support to organizations that are working around digital inclusion, but focusing mainly on people with disabilities. We've found a way of identifying what are the key issues that are affected by people with disabilities, and how can this be put into policy perspective, because you realize that there are few countries in Africa that really have policies, digital policies, that are targeting people with disabilities. So part of our research informed this kind of wide approach. You've all heard about our Africa Digital Rights Fund, where we provide small grants to organizations that are working on an array of issues. So part of this, our focus is on people with disabilities, because one is you may advocate for a policy, but then there are these underlying issues that need also to be addressed. So yeah, in a nutshell, I can say that that is what we are working on currently. Of course, we continue engaging, understanding, building capacity. We've looked at the issues of, digital safety for people with disabilities, because we understand that there are quite a number of issues when it comes, say, with people with disabilities using technology. Some of them, like say, if someone is impaired, they cannot see, then they would depend on someone else to, open for them the account or read for them the account. But then also from issues of access in terms of, say, gadgets, how can this be, easily accessible? And this has to be in the policy, taken on into policy perspective. So part of our work, most of our work right now, and that is on commentary, researching, but also kind of empowering different, organizations, especially those that are directly working with people with disabilities, and introducing them into the digital, into the policy making processes, and then see how they can work with us or work with different actors in pushing for inclusivity. I think you're muted. I can't. I just see your lips moving. You're muted.
Yeah, apologies. Thank you so much, Lilian. Thanks for that. Thank you. So I have a question for Victor right here from our participants. So I have a question from Gloria, and she's asking, under the Kenya Constitution, public participation is a right. Let me take that again. Under the Kenya Constitution, public participation is a right. So the question is, can a law be challenged in court on grounds of failure to adequately involve the public in its formulation? Victor, did you get that?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Gloria, for that question. Very, very important. Kenya's constitution in Article 10 provides for public participation as a principle of governance, and it requires all state and public officials, whenever they consider any law or want to make any public policy decision, to involve the public. And public participation is a process, and unfortunately what we have in Kenya, other than that provision, we don't have a proper legal framework that actually provides the mechanisms and the details, the nuts and bolts of how to make public participation meaningful and actually a reality. And as a result, what we've seen over the years is a very ad hoc, haphazard approach where the level of participation will be determined by the institution or public official who is running the process. And the good thing is that our courts have been alive to the abuses of this provision, and quite a number of lawmaking processes have been challenged in court, and the courts have, to a large extent, at least in recent history, led the charge to protect the rights of the public to participation, including the most recent case on the Building Bridges Initiative, where both the High Court and the Court of Appeal reinforced the supremacy of the people in governance. With that as it may, there is a public participation bill that has been in the works, unfortunately, since 2018, and the same has not been adopted by Parliament as a law, and that is where currently the struggle is. But in response to your question, yes, public participation guarantees have been challenged in court, and courts have taken steps to either nullify processes which did not include the public, or where public participation was not meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Funny, I have another question that actually looks like that. So this is more on like gaps or opportunities in legal frameworks in Kenya or Eastern Africa regarding public participation. So this person is asking if you've noticed any gaps or opportunities in legal framework in Kenya or Eastern Africa, and what is your advice on how to address or take advance of this?
I think one of the big gaps which I just mentioned is the absence of policy and legal frameworks to public participation a reality, number one, and also to make it meaningful, number two. Because what we have, there's no clear standard, there are no clear principles, there are no clear methods, there are no clear processes and procedures, there are no clear obligations on state bodies, there are no clear specifications of timelines that need to be observed, there is no clear standard on transparency or the level of transparency and accountability that's required to make public participation a reality. And as we commemorate the Day on Access to Information, it's important that we codify this access to information laws so that this information is also available during lawmaking processes. One of the biggest challenges has been the lack of, the opacity of these processes and the absence of information, or even the limitations in accessing the information. And therefore, civil society organizations need to work with the public to challenge the processes that remain opaque, to bring down the walls that, and barriers that prevent the public from effectively participating in policy and lawmaking processes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Victor. So I have one last question here before we round up this particular session. I have it from Brenda, and I think I'd like to direct the question to Ekai. Okay, let me direct it to Ephraim, because I have one last question for Ekai. So from Brenda, I have what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure more participation by the youth and women, especially during such times like during the COVID-19 pandemic? Ephraim, can you?
Thank you so much. So just to re-echo what can be done to include youth and women, as I mentioned, such a pandemic time, it's an opportune time. ICT processes, using ICTs and Zoom. There's never been a time in my recollection over the last 8, 9, 10 years, or even if you've studied policymaking processes across the region, there's never been a time when policymaking processes have been this open. This is like a really, really opportune time for people to know these processes that are going on, who's leading some of the processes and how to get involved. So getting involved, following, for example, I'll give an example in Kenya and maybe Uganda. So in Kenya, there's an organization, for example, called Mzalendo Watch that tweets and regularly publishes on their website what is happening in Parliament. This bill is being discussed by this member of Parliament. It's being fronted. This is the stage of the bill. This is the dates. This is the access credentials, login, and stuff like that. Even when it was offline, they would do that. Following such kind of institutions, or Uganda, Parliament Watch, I think it's called Parliament Watch Uganda, or if I'm not wrong. There's similar organizations across Eastern Africa, figuring out when are these conversations being held and logging in and engaging. Right now, you can engage in policy-making process as a Kenyan, but you are outside. You might be outside, let's say, in Mombasa or Kisumu or Eldoret, and engage in policy-making processes in Nairobi, which initially was difficult because a long time ago, you'd have to come to Nairobi, meet the parliamentarians, or go, if they're having a retreat in the coast or somewhere, meet them there, or Naivasha and meet them there, and require your resources and time and sleeping arrangements. Right now, it's very, very the most opportune time for everyone to get involved. So I just emphasize that we need to take advantage of the opportunity and to push also our parliamentarians to keep these processes open or hybrid, even when the world resumes normality with the pandemic starting to fade away. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ephraim. So Ekai, I have one last question for you before we round up this particular session. So very quickly, I want you to talk about the urban engagement, the style and strategies for engagement in urban areas and the rural areas. I like to believe that you don't approach both locations and both demography with the same strategy and the same methods. So could you just give us like a little bit of background on that, and if there's any difference, in the approaches for citizen engagement in both areas. That's for Ekai.
Okay, it was taking a long time. Thanks. That's a very good question. So the realities of the divide between the urban and the rural communities in any part of Africa are real. And the fact that, for instance, what works in Nairobi or what works in Kampala or what works in Lusaka, Zambia, does not necessarily work in the remote villages of those countries. So how you approach public participation in a city forum, in an urban setting, is different from how you approach it at a rural setting. For instance, at an urban setting, for instance, maybe what the Ministry of ICT in Kenya and the Ministry of Health have been doing has been very correct, because most people, for instance, in Nairobi are able to access the internet. I mean, like, I don't know of anybody in Nairobi who doesn't have a smartphone. All of them have a smartphones, and 4G network and 5G now, and very tech savvy guys and all that. Yeah. So how the Minister of ICT has been doing it may have been working for the urban setting because people are tech savvy, people have internet. But now that webinarization cannot work in the village, in the rural parts of Africa. So you have to go there and try to translate the document, for instance, into the local language. Let the people understand what public participation is all about and how their comments will be made. And it's also important to note that, for instance, in the Kenyan context, if you go to northern Kenya and you want to get views from the citizens in that part of the world about a particular law, I mean, they will look at you as if lawmaking is a reserve for the people in Nairobi. They're like, okay, the government can be made even without us, even numerical numbers wise. So that also has to be demystified, because every voice of every citizen matters, whether in the urban setting or in the rural setting. And it will be a bit absurd, for instance, to go to the village, take a huge document. You haven't even translated it into Kiswahili language, for instance, in Kenya or Tanzania. That ought to change, because you can only make sense in the village if you speak to the people in the language they understand, and they can only make sensible, prescriptions for law reform if they understand what the law is all about and what is being asked of them. So to me, there has to be a divide between the two, urban and rural, and the divide is very clear. You can do webinarization in the urban setting, but you can't do that in the village. That is what I can say about that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for that. I don't think I have any more questions from participants. So I'd just like to go straight to the end of this particular discussion. Once again, thank you to all our panelists.
Sorry.
Hello?
Yeah, yes. Sorry, yeah. I needed to add something to the question from Brenda to what Ephraim had responded to on what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure more participation by youth and women, especially in times like this. I think in addition to what Ephraim shared earlier, there is need for really capacity building, because when it comes to digital policy making, a lot goes, a lot happens. And there's one way identifying the different, say, institutions that are doing this kind of work. But then I think then there is need to have more vigilancy in engaging more of women and youth to understand what are the underlying trends when it comes to, say, their participation, or maybe when it comes to, say, the digital world. For women, there are issues of access, there are issues of violence and all that. So when it comes to that, there's need for an actual kind of, capacity building, one to understand these issues and how this can translate into, say, advocating for better policies. So the issue of capacity building in digital policy making is something that can be taken on. And also, I think the other thing, like Ephraim mentioned, is to emphasize for the young people, for the women to take opportunities of, of the different mechanisms or the different opportunities as they arise. Right now, I know there's a lot of Zooming, there are lots of development partners. I think all the money that was in travel is being actually put into looking for, funding initiatives that are, addressing, digital issues or digital challenges in this post-COVID era. And this is an opportunity that, institutions like ours can look into, tap into those resources and engage the youth in actually understanding what are these issues before just rushing and saying there's a document and, you just go and start, commenting when you don't really understand what is the actual problem in that particular policy. So that is what I wanted to supplement to what Ephraim had earlier shared.
Okay, thanks so much, Lillian. Thanks for that addition. Thank you. So, like I said, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for a very robust and insightful conversation. And to the participants, thanks for joining, the discussion. I'm sure we were able to follow the conversation and also pick the heart of it when it comes to, the theme that we discussed. So very quickly, I'd like to, give each of our panelists 1 minute to make a concluding point from their end before we round off. Is that fine? I'd like to start with Ekai. Ekai, please, can we just have a concluding point from you for a minute? And then after that, we'll have Victor, then Lillian, and then Ephraim.
Yes.
Ekai, are you there?
Yes, please, will you come up again? Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. I said I wanted to give each of the panelists 1 minute to make a concluding point. So I wanted to start from you, based on today's discourse. What would you like to leave us with? What would you like to leave participants with going forward?
Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to make remarks to the topic under discussion, public participation in the era of COVID-19 in policy making. We don't take it for granted that we have had this opportunity to share our thoughts, which are never correct anyway, but we share them because we think they are what we think is the reality on the ground and the experience we have. So going forward, I would like to urge authorities out there, anybody who is in charge of public participation, be it in parliament, be it at the government level, be it we the people, we the citizens. I think we should take that very seriously. And as I mentioned before, maybe it is time to make public participation great again. With the realities around COVID-19, how can we make sure that public participation is real? It's beneficial to the lawmaking process, so that we don't just have laws being passed through a process just to tick the box that we had a webinar, so we did it. Tick. That ought not to be the way to approach it. So that is my last thought, and I look forward to participating in the rest of the conference and contributing to more ideas. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Thanks. Muted.
Sorry, Victor, can we have your 1 minute concluding point?
So how do you want to work on?
Thank you very much. I think what I'd like to say is that as we explore ways of making public participation meaningful, we need to diagnose our current frameworks, our policies, and our practices to identify the gaps and to innovate around how we engage and to catalyze how governments and other state agencies engage the public. I think we must bring all stakeholders together and explore ways of making public participation meaningful and to continue improving the processes. Just because that there's a certain way that agencies have involved people doesn't mean that that's the only way. We can, and COVID has taught us that we can use these very ICT platforms to make engagement more meaningful, bring more people on board, and ultimately deliver on the promise of ICTs as is desired by the majority of people on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Victor. Thank you. Lillian, would you like to leave us with something?
Yes, thank you. My key takeaways would be that meaningful public participation in policy making, especially digital policy making, involves quite a number of issues. But again, we need to invest more into understanding the processes, build capacity of different stakeholders, not just citizens, policymakers, law enforcement, because these are the people who will be implementing. So having this kind of, multi-stakeholder approach to engagement is something that we need to focus on. And of course, borrowing from what we've had so far earlier in this forum is the need to continuously engage. Someone said once, I think I had people brought it out differently. One was said we need to make more noise, and the other one said we needed more work. So more work is in having to find ways of engaging different stakeholders into understanding the digital policy issues and also how to get involved in the policy-making process. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Thanks. Ephraim, can we have you now?
Yes, thank you. So I would just record 3 points. One, resources, investing in resources, just echoing also what my previous panelists have said. Second, in processes, and then third, more information. So beyond just information literacy, but also sharing more information in a meaningful and time and with consideration of time for citizens to engage. Those are the 3 things that I just re-echo and summarize from this conversation. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you, Ephraim. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Lillian, Ephraim, Victor, and Ekai. Thank you for that robust session. Thank you also to our participants. Kindly note that the FIFA Africa conference is still going on, and then we would be looking forward to the other sessions for the conference. So in the absence of anything or any other thing, I'd like to wish us a good day. And also, please do not forget to follow us on social media, IRA, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook to know more about our activities and some of these issues that we just discussed today during this session. There's plenty more where that came from. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining. In the absence of any other thing, I'd like to say goodbye to you all, and I'm sure we'll catch up during the conference or some other time. Thank you all. Bye. Thank you, Lillian.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Victor.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.